In this session, we want to talk about the process of selecting those who will serve either in the role of elder overseer or in the role of deacon, again, the term servant or ministry team leader. Um, 1 Timothy teaches us this, and I think we can apply it to either role. 1 Timothy 5:22, it comes in the context of accusations that are coming up against those who are serving as elders. And Paul warns us, and we'll come to the text a little bit later, Paul warns us to not be hasty in the laying on of hands. In other words, don't move too quickly. Now, we've already discussed the dynamic that an elder overseer should not be a recent convert. Now we see this don't move too quickly dynamic. And that perhaps is where we should best start, is that this should be intentional. This should be something that is thought out, that is prayerful, so that is prayed out. And in that dynamic, we want to recognize that and the selection process at times, we're actually reactionary rather than being proactive, rather than being intentional. Where I want to label this is not with some of the organizational jargon we hear popular today. I really just want to put the label on it, discipleship. I don't know at times that we're very intentional at discipling individuals into leadership roles in the church. Now, this could be true when it comes to your family as well. My kids right now, we're trying to teach them how to clean up after dinner. And so I could say to my 8-year-old son, hey son, do the dishes. And if I don't sit there and walk with him the first few times to teach him how to do the dishes, that there is a certain way of rinsing off dishes and putting them in the dishwasher. And as you get them out, you probably ought to have your hands washed and check and make sure they're clean, all of those dynamics. Then it's not really fair to me to go, hey, do this job, have this responsibility, and go. Well, that's going to cause all kinds of problems. In fact, it does. He doesn't put dishes back where they go the right way. My wife comes and says, who put the dishes away? And I'll go, well, I was delegating responsibility. This happens in the church so often. Do not be hasty in the laying on of hands. I hope you see the connection. We need to be more intentional in discipling those in our church along a long trajectory of life. And so some of the complications that you may be experiencing in selecting leaders, I hear this all the time as I work with churches. Well, we don't have anyone who's qualified, anyone who's ready, anyone who wants to serve. Well, some of that comes back on us as leaders of taking people and calling them to a deeper level of discipleship, but not doing it just because it's in the election cycle. So let me bring it to the second part of this conversation. Too often we're led by our bylaws that are maybe, if we look at them, we could say maybe outdated. I would argue this, maybe they're less biblical than what we'd like to admit. At times, bylaws force our hand to make selections that we wouldn't otherwise make when it comes to the biblical, even this biblical command to not be hasty in the laying on of hands. And so we have this congregational meeting that comes up once a year. We need to nominate people. And so when people are nominated and then we vote it, we put it to a popular vote, and it ends up looking like a high school election or a social club board more than it does a biblical family or biblical households. That is the master metaphor, by the way, of 1 Timothy. And so in this dynamic, I want to just encourage you to ask some intentionality questions. As we asked this question a number of years ago in a ministry I was able to be a part of, we started bringing in individuals we saw the potential in their maturity, their character, as well as their gifting, that they might be someone that would be called to the role of overseer elder in the future. And so we started bringing them in on meetings occasionally and asking them what they thought. Now, they didn't know what we were doing, but we said, hey, we're thinking about making this decision, or hey, this is a dynamic that's going on, and we wanted to get your opinion. What do you think? And we started observing how they interacted with people and how they taught and how they discipled. And we started observing their families and we got to know them intentionally. And then we let them know, hey, we're thinking about this role for you. And over the course of the next year, over the course of the next 2 years, we'd like to invite you in more to these meetings and into these moments where we go call on someone and where we carry out church discipline with an issue. And we want to see you participate with us in some of these things and grow into this role. Well, maybe that illustration of me walking alongside my son and helping him understand how to do the dishes is appropriate after all. And then when the time would come where they would be ready and we would say we need them to step into this role, we could call them into it, but they knew that what they were getting into and we knew who they were. Do not be hasty in the laying on of hands. So a couple things that I would argue, and really not argue, I would suggest for you. Number one, I would challenge you to establish discipleship habits I would even argue requirements amongst your current leaders now. Like if your leaders aren't discipling, how is it they're called leaders in the church where our primary purpose is to make disciples? You see the tension? And we should feel this tension ourselves, right? That our primary role in the community of God, in the church, is to go out and make disciples, baptizing them. Now that might look different. It might be making disciples of those who have never heard of Jesus, or growing those who have heard of Jesus into more mature disciples. But discipleship, making it a requirement amongst your current leaders. So if that's elders bringing along other people to teach them how to be mature in their faith, to teach and to protect the doctrine, or whether that's deacons bringing other people along to help them learn how to be a servant leader like Jesus, each of those roles can have that responsibility. Here's number 2 when it comes to my suggestions of how you would choose and select those who are going to be in these leadership roles. Number 2 is this: look for those whom God is calling. I know that seems vague, and so I think you need to be in prayer about this, but I think God will actually, at times, bring people to you that you will need down the road, and that you have some opportunity to look for them and go, okay, here's a need. Who has God provided? Now, I think there's an intersection between God's work and our intentionality. So discipleship and this go together. See what I'm doing here? God is doing something, we are doing something, and it somehow comes together, and God is able to build the health of his church that way. An example of this I had early on in my ministry, I knew that we needed to revamp our missions efforts. It was at that time called a missions committee, and again, committees make decisions, teams act, and servants do, they serve. So we wanted this missions committee to become more service-oriented, that to not just give money away, but partner with people and to serve. And I know that that's a continuing trend amongst the way we talk about missions in our churches. Well, I wanted someone to lead this, and so for a while I had stepped in as the senior minister and helped help establish some culture with the missions team, with that group. But in the midst of my prayers, this individual joined our church, and their family joined our church from Texas. And I remember as she drove onto our parking lot, I leaned into her car one day and said, "What is God calling you to do?" I don't do this to everyone I meet on the street, but I did it this day. And she says, "I really want to send people out into the missions field. I want to equip missionaries and encourage missionaries." And I was just like, here it is. Like, here's the person. And over the next couple of years, this person and I kind of helped establish this leadership dynamic in our church. And in reality, we watched as our church, in many ways, was shaped and transformed by this individual and their leadership in our missions team. Well, sometimes God says, here's a person who I'm giving you, and you need to keep your eyes open for them and to be able to ask questions. Who is God calling into some of these roles? Here's the next one. You need to test them. We've mentioned this text before, 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 10. Let them be tested first. This is why you bring them into meetings and why you watch them serve. You're watching their character. You're looking at their family. You're observing them. Let them be tested. But I want to argue that one of the things we fail to do at times is to ask God to equip them, to pray over them. Throughout the New Testament, we see that those who are called to a specific task in the church are oftentimes prayed over by elders and those who are leaders in the church. With this process we call ordination. And I don't want to back away from that. I know that many times we've backed away from maybe even the word ordination. What I don't want to back away from is the concept of asking God to enable and empower this person to meet some of the needs or some of the responsibilities that they're called to do in our church. This becomes a powerful witness opportunity where we ask God to intersect the life of this person or this family and say, God, use them. They have lived for you, use them. And we're setting them up as an example, because ultimately what we're doing with these leaders is we're saying, this is what it looks like to follow after Jesus. This is what a transformed life looks like. And so I want to challenge you to make sure that as you select people, you're walking through this process of praying for them at the kind of the commissioning part of what you're calling them to do. I want to talk about this last element here in this session, and that is, what about those who are already established as leaders? They have a responsibility, they have a role that they're playing out, but the above reproach, we've talked about being above reproach. This idea of a picture comes into question. Something happens in their life. They make a decision, they fall, or maybe like 1 Timothy says, they shipwreck their faith, they wander, they go astray. What happens when that happens? At that particular time, we do come back to 1 Timothy, maybe chapter 5. There's other places as well. Jesus talks about this in the book of Matthew. We see discipline texts in the Corinthian correspondence. But we come back to this and we recognize the primary role of the overseers and elders, or overseers elders, is to protect the gospel. That is not just the teaching of the gospel when it comes to our words, it's also the teaching of the gospel when it comes to the examples of those who are leaders. And so we have this reality that plays out that sometimes it's a ministry team leader, a deacon, sometimes it is an elder. In the case of 1 Timothy 5, it's an elder, at least an accusation against an elder. And so Paul says this, that when this happens, we are not to respond to this with prejudgment, or on the opposite side, with kind of a prioritization of that leader, or a protection of that leader that's partiality. Listen to what Paul says. Do not admit a charge against an elder except on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. You hear the Old Testament echo there. As for those who persist in sin, what's happening here? It's not that they have sinned, it's that they keep sinning. They are no longer able to be described as being above reproach by those on the inside or by those on the outside. The witness of the church is threatened. Rebuke them, here's the difficult part, in the presence of all. Now, this isn't how we respond to sin for every person in the church. In fact, if you read what Jesus says in the book of Matthew, it's, one person goes and then 2 people. We minimize kind of the blast radius of that conflict. But in this case, we actually put that in front of everyone and say, no, this person is being disciplined because of this. Why is that? Well, part of it is because the last dynamic we've just said. We have put them in front of everyone else and prayed over them and commissioned them as a leader. And now, because the witness of the church and because of the health of the church is threatened, we rebuke them now in the presence of all. Now, that rebuke is still done with the heart of Christ. It's still done with gentleness. It's still done with the intentionality of restoration and reconciliation. We don't minimize any of those things as the foundation of who we are. But at the same time, we're preserving the health of the church. We do this so that the rest may stand in a healthy fear. We do this in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus. We do this in their presence. In fact, what we see in the book of Matthew, when Jesus talks about conflict and controversy, when it comes to confrontation, he says, wherever 2 or 3 or more are gathered in my name, I'm there with them. Now, we've taken that at times out of context and said, prayer meeting, Jesus is here. At times we've thrown that verse out because we've said, hey, we rip it out of context, so let's never use it. Let's put it back into context. This text, as well as Matthew, says, when you are confronting these difficult issues, I'm there with you. So I often say, when I deal with these texts, Jesus is just as present in the midst of conflict and confrontation as he is in the moment of communion. And that's why he reminds us, because he's always here. So why does he say, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I'm there with them? Well, we need that reminder that when we gather for these kinds of difficult things, he's going to be with us. We do this in the presence of God, in the presence of Christ Jesus and the elect angels. And he says, I urge you to keep these rules without 2 things, prejudging this person, so without hearing the witnesses, or without partiality, by just standing by their side and not hearing the witnesses. Now, I don't know when you're hearing this video, but I will say this, recent news in kind of just the church world cause us to pause here and go, we need to pay attention. That when a leader has accusations against them of an ongoing sin, of a sin that causes them to no longer be able to be considered above reproach by the world around that is looking in, or by the people who are inside looking up to those who are examples of Christ, then we need to listen. We can't stand by with partiality and not listen, nor do we prejudge. This calls for wisdom. It is in that moment that Paul says, do not be hasty in the laying on of hands. You see what's at stake? Paul says, slow down in your development and discipleship of leaders, in your selection of leaders. Slow down, because the consequences are severe. There's a ton at stake when it comes to the witness of the gospel and the maturity of the people of God and the health of the church. Do not be hasty in the laying on of hands, nor take part in the sins of others, but keep yourself pure. One of the hardest things as a leader to do in the midst of difficult times is just to keep our own motivations pure, to not get bought into all of the sin. This process of selecting leaders is one of those that is very intentional. It's much like raising your children. Raising children one step at a time, and then eventually saying, I think you're ready for this. When I was a kid, my dad would raise the basketball hoop in my backyard a couple inches when I would be in bed. And the hope is that I would continue to try to dunk the basketball in our little basketball hoop in the backyard. And the goal was for him really to help me to grow and develop as a basketball player. And in many ways, we give people responsibilities that help them in their discipleship to continue to be challenged in Christ, to need him and to live like him, and to be an example for those who are just a little bit lower than them when it comes to their own discipleship journey. I pray for you and your church, and that's part of this process for me, is praying for the church. God cares about your church, and he knows those who are part of your church community, and he provides. Now, are all of them perfect? No. But at the same time, he is going to provide people in your church to meet the needs, and they have some freedom to decide if they'll step up to that. So I want to speak to, last few minutes, speak to those of you who are being asked to consider a leadership role. The church needs individuals who are not perfect, but who are determined to follow Christ faithfully and with integrity. The church needs people who will sacrifice maybe people being happy with them, who will be willing to be criticized. The church needs individuals who will sacrifice time and energy and love and maybe be spit on in return. The church needs people who will be willing to follow Jesus faithfully and endure and do it for the long run. Sometimes that person is a person like you. So I'll challenge you to prayerfully consider, what could God do through you in your own church community?